Picture this: the vast, wind-swept plains of Asia stretching endlessly under a sky so wide it feels like another world. At the heart of it all, a young Venetian merchant named Marco Polo steps into the dazzling court of Kublai Khan, a ruler whose empire spanned continents and whose name alone commanded awe. This wasn't just a journey across deserts and mountains. It was a plunge into a realm of unimaginable splendor and danger, where every moment could mean the difference between fortune and ruin. For 17 years, Marco lived among the Mongols, not as a prisoner, but as a trusted outsider, granted rare access to the secrets of the most powerful empire on earth. And what he witnessed there, the ceremonies, the strategies, the sheer scale of Mongol ambition, would rewrite the way Europe saw the world forever. But here's the thing, most of us know Marco Polo as the guy who inspired a swimming pool game, or whose name gets tossed around in history books. The real story, it's so much wilder. Imagine golden tents shimmering under the sun, warriors clad in silk armor, and a court where spies and diplomats played a deadly game of influence. Marco didn't just observe this world, he survived it. He learned its languages, navigated its politics, and even earned the favor of Kublai Khan himself. How did a foreigner, an outsider, manage to not only stay alive but thrive in a place where missteps could cost lives? That's where the real intrigue begins. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on Marco Polo's years in the Mongol court, revealing 20 gripping details that bring this extraordinary chapter of history to life. From the Khan's secret rituals to Marco's brushes with disaster, these aren't just footnotes, they are pulse-pounding moments that show what it truly meant to walk in his shoes. You'll discover how the Mongols used paper money centuries before Europe caught on, why Marco's descriptions of their palaces left readers doubting his sanity, and how a single miscommunication nearly got him killed. This isn't just history, it's an adventure, a survival story, and a glimpse into a world so rich and complex, you'll feel like you're right there beside him. So settle in, because by the time we're done, you'll see Marco Polo's journey in a whole new light. Among all the extraordinary privileges Marco Polo received in the Mongol Empire, none was more vital or more dazzling than the golden tablet known as a Pazer. Picture a heavy slab of gold, engraved with the Great Khan's official seal, its characters commanding instant obedience from every official, soldier, and innkeeper across thousands of miles. This wasn't just a travel permit, it was a master key to the entire empire. Wherever Marco went, the Pazer guaranteed him fresh horses from the legendary Mongol postal stations, lavish meals at roadside wayposts, and armed escorts through dangerous territories. In a realm where strangers could be seen as spies or worse, this golden passport transformed Marco from a suspicious foreigner into a man with the Khan's own authority radiating from his hands. But here's what made it even more extraordinary. The penalty for ignoring the Pazer was death. No excuses, no exceptions. If a local governor hesitated to provide supplies or a guard refused him safe passage, their defiance wasn't just disobedience, it was an insult to Kublai Khan himself, punishable by execution. This wasn't bureaucracy, it was raw imperial power distilled into a single object. And Marco didn't just carry it, he used it to traverse lands no European had ever seen, from the frozen wastes of Siberia to the spice-filled markets of modern-day Beijing. What's truly revealing, though, isn't just the Pazer's power, but why Kublai granted it in the first place. The Khan was no naive ruler handing out favors. He surrounded himself with advisors, spies, and warriors, each vying for influence. For Marco to earn this level of trust, he must have proven himself indispensable, perhaps through his knack for languages, his merchant's eye for detail, or his ability to entertain the Khan with stories of distant Venice. That golden tablet wasn't just a gift, it was a silent proclamation that Marco Polo had become something far rarer than a guest. He was, in the Khan's eyes, a bridge between worlds. Imagine an entire city rising and vanishing like a mirage, buildings folding into carts, golden tents collapsing like theater sets, and 1,000 servants moving with the precision of a military campaign. This wasn't just a royal procession, it was Kublai Khan's mobile court, a spectacle Marco Polo witnessed with awe. The Mongols didn't just conquer land, they brought their empire with them, transforming any stretch of wilderness into a glittering capital within hours. At the heart of it all stood the Khan's personal tent, a palace on horseback lined with the rarest furs, ermine and sable so luxurious, they made European royalty look like peasants by comparison. But the real marvel wasn't just the opulence, it was the engineering. Marco described how entire wooden palaces, complete with gilded pillars and silk-adorned chambers, were designed to disassemble into sections and mount onto massive ox-drawn carts. Picture these colossal structures creaking across the steppe, followed by a caravan of scribes, cooks, guards, and diplomats, all maintaining the rhythm of government on the move. While medieval European kings were bogged down by their static castles, Kublai Khan held court from a mountaintop one week and a river valley the next, issuing decrees between hunts or even mid-battle. This mobility was more than just a display of wealth, it was a weapon. By refusing to be tied to one place, the Khan kept rivals guessing, administered justice in person across his realm, and projected power with every mile traveled. Marco noted how local governors would scramble to prepare feasts, and lodging whenever the court's approach was signaled by clouds of dust on the horizon. Missing a single detail, a poorly stocked larder or a torn carpet could mean disgrace. Yet for all its grandeur, the mobile city also revealed the Mongols' deepest strength, their adaptability. While other empires grew brittle under bureaucracy, the Khan's court thrived precisely because it never stood still. What Marco couldn't have known was how this system mirrored the Mongols' entire worldview. To them, permanence was weakness, a stone palace was a target, a tent was freedom. And in that tension between grandeur and motion, we see the genius of Kublai Khan, a ruler who could outmaneuver enemies not just with armies, but with the sheer audacity of his lifestyle. When Marco later wrote of cities that seemed to vanish overnight, Venetian readers dismissed it as fantasy. But for those who'd seen the Khan's caravan in motion, the truth was clear. The greatest empire on earth lived by the rhythm of the wind. One of the most breathtaking spectacles Marco Polo described wasn't a battle or a palace, it was the Khan's hunting grounds, where the sky itself became a weapon. Kublai Khan didn't just ride out with bows and horses, he commanded a feathered army of golden eagles, each with wingspans wider than a man's reach, trained to swoop down and snatch wolves clean off the ground. These weren't pets, they were predators bred for precision, and their hunts were choreographed like a lethal ballet. But the true marvel wasn't the eagles' razor-sharp talons or their terrifying speed. It was the way the Mongols controlled them, not with shouts or gestures, but with an intricate whistle language, a code of chirps and trills that could direct a bird to strike, circle, or release its prey mid-flight. Marco, ever the eager student, tried to learn this secret language and failed spectacularly. In his writings, he admits that no matter how he pursed his lips or mimicked his tutors, the eagles ignored him. To the Mongols, this wasn't just amusing, it was proof of how deeply their bond with these birds ran. The The whistle codes weren't arbitrary sounds, they were a refined system, passed down through generations, calibrated to each eagle's instincts. A single misstep, like a mistimed pitch, could send a bird veering off course or, worse, diving at the wrong target. Yet these hunts were far more than entertainment for the Khan's court. Watch closely, and you'd see the same tactics the Mongols used to devastating effect in war: silent coordination, split-second timing, and an almost supernatural control over chaos. While European armies relied on drums and banners, the Mongols had mastered a form of communication that left no trace, no smoke signals, no shouted orders, just a flicker of movement in the sky. It's no accident that Marco noted how the Khan's generals often joined these expeditions. They weren't just spectators, they were studying. Every hunt doubled as a training exercise, sharpening the same skills that let Mongol armies move like a single organism across battlefields. What Marco couldn't have known was how deeply this tradition reached into Mongol identity. To them, the eagle wasn't just a tool, it was a mirror of their own values: ruthless efficiency, unbreakable discipline, and a harmony between human and nature that bordered on the mystical. Even the Khan's choice of prey was symbolic. Wolves, the steppe's most cunning predators, weren't just targets, they were rivals. By hunting them with eagles, the Mongols weren't just proving their dominance over the wild, they were rehearsing it. And in that silent dialogue between whistle and wingbeat, Marco glimpsed something far more profound than a sport. He saw the heartbeat of an empire. Marco Polo stood dumbfounded the first time he saw a Mongol merchant hand over a simple piece of paper, not gold, not silver, in exchange for an entire wagon of spices. To his Venetian eyes, raised on the clink of ducats and florins, this flimsy rectangle with its smudged ink and crimson seal looked like child's play. But here, in the heart of Kublai Khan's empire, paper money wasn't just real, it was law. Each note, stamped with the Khan's official seal and inscribed with a warning that counterfeiters would be punished by death, held the same value as precious metal. And unlike Europe's patchwork of currencies that changed at every border, this system worked seamlessly across thousands of miles, from the rice paddies of southern China to the frigid outposts of Siberia. The genius of Mongol money lay in its brutal simplicity. The Khan didn't just print currency, he controlled it utterly. Government workshops, guarded like fortresses, produced the notes from mulberry bark paper so durable it could survive years of folding and trade. Every step from the paper-making to the calligraphy was a state secret, but the real stroke of brilliance, the Khan's decree that all taxes, all trade, all debts must be settled in his paper money. Overnight, gold hoarded under floors became worthless unless exchanged for notes at official treasuries, effectively funneling the empire's wealth straight into the Khan's coffers. Marco's attempts to explain this system back in Venice sparked outright laughter. Wealthy merchants clutched their coin purses, certain he'd been duped by some oriental trick. How could paper, vulnerable to fire or flood, possibly hold value? What they couldn't grasp was the Khan's unshakable authority behind each note. While European kings debased their coins by mixing in cheaper metals, the Mongol system relied on sheer terror. Counterfeiters weren't just hanged, their families were enslaved. The punishment was so feared that Marco recorded only a handful of cases in 17 years. Yet for all its violence, the system worked with startling efficiency. Traders no longer needed to haul heavy chests of coins across deserts. Markets flourished with standardized prices. Even soldiers' salaries could be paid in lightweight notes, transforming logistics. The Khan didn't just invent modern currency, he weaponized it, using paper to bind his empire tighter than any army could. When Marco described clerks burning stacks of worn-out notes in public ceremonies, proof that even destroyed money retained its sacred trust, his listeners simply shook their heads. To them, it sounded like magic. To the Mongols, it was just another day in history's first truly global economy. While European messengers were still trudging along muddy roads on exhausted horses, the Mongols had perfected something extraordinary, a communication network so fast it seemed to defy the laws of geography. Marco Polo called it the yam, a word that would soon echo through his writings with a mix of awe and envy. Picture this, a lone rider galloping across the steppe, his coat billowing, a belt of bells ringing with each stride. Before he even reached the horizon, fresh horses were already being saddled at the next station, their handlers alerted by the distant jingle. No rest, no delays, just a seamless relay where messages could leap 200 miles in a single day, faster than a storm front sweeping across the plains. What made the yam truly revolutionary wasn't just the speed, it was the precision. Every 25 miles, without fail, stood a way station stocked with food, spare mounts, and even backup riders in case of injury. Each outpost was a well-oiled cog in a machine that spanned the empire, from the frozen rivers of Russia to the humid ports of Vietnam. Marco marveled at how a single dispatch from Kublai Khan could reach the farthest corners of his realm in weeks, while European kings waited months for replies from their own dukes. The Mongols didn't just move information, they weaponized it, turning time itself into an advantage. But here's the twist, the yam wasn't just for official decrees. Merchants could pay to use the system, their goods whisked across deserts with the same efficiency as imperial orders. Even foreign envoys like Marco himself could request fresh horses if they carried the right credentials. This wasn't just a postal service, it was the internet of the 13th century, a network that bound the empire together with threads of shared knowledge and commerce. The real stroke of genius, though, lay in the details. Riders wore identical uniforms to avoid confusion at handoffs. Each station kept meticulous logs, tracking every message's progress like a modern tracking number. And woe to any station master who failed his duty, neglecting to have horses ready meant facing punishment so severe. Marco noted that laziness simply didn't exist in the yam. By the time he returned to Venice, where letters might languish for weeks in some noble's dusty hall, he realized the bitter truth: Europe wasn't just behind the Mongols. It wasn't even playing the same game. Behind the gold-stitched curtains of Kublai Khan's court lay a world Marco Polo could only describe in fragments: the forbidden women's quarters, a labyrinth of perfumed chambers where the Khan's 4 principal wives and hundreds of concubines lived in gilded seclusion. These weren't mere ornaments, they were political chess pieces, each selected for beauty, noble lineage, and the alliances they secured. Marco caught fleeting glimpses of their existence: silk slippers whispering across marble floors, the rustle of embroidered robes just out of sight, the occasional laughter echoing from behind screens where no outsider dared look directly. What fascinated him most wasn't just the opulence, jeweled hairpins worth a Venetian merchant's yearly income, fountains flowing with rose water, but the invisible power these women wielded. While European queens held court publicly, Mongol noblewomen ruled from the shadows. They managed vast estates, commanded servants, and even influenced military appointments through carefully placed words in the Khan's ear. Marco noted how the Khan's favorite wife, Chabai, famously intervened to spare Confucian scholars from execution, proving how a well-timed plea could alter imperial policy. Yet for all their influence, the rules were ironclad. Any man caught glancing at the Khan's women faced instant execution, a fact Marco learned when a visiting diplomat was caught peering through a lattice and vanished before sundown. The penalty wasn't just about jealousy, it was about control. By isolating his inner circle, the Khan turned his household into a fortress of loyalty. Even servants were eunuchs or elderly women, ensuring no rival bloodlines could challenge his heirs. Marco's accounts pulse with unspoken tension, the hushed rivalries between wives vying for the Khan's attention, the concubines scheming to elevate their sons, the whispered alliances that could topple fortunes. He never witnessed these dramas firsthand, but the clues were everywhere: the sudden disappearance of a favored singer, the overnight promotion of an obscure noblewoman's brother, the way certain names abruptly vanished from court records. This was power played not with swords, but with silken cords tight enough to strangle, soft enough to leave no marks. What Marco couldn't articulate, perhaps didn't fully grasp, was how this system mirrored Mongol society itself. Just as the Khan's women balanced privilege with peril, the entire empire thrived on a knife's edge between reward and ruin. One misstep, one moment of lost favor, and the most pampered concubine could find herself tending goats on the frozen steppe. In that tension between silk and steel, Marco glimpsed the Khan's greatest lesson. True power wasn't about freedom. It was about making every cage feel like a throne room. The night before a Mongol army marched, the camp fell eerily silent. No boasting warriors, no clattering swords, just the hushed rustle of star charts unfurling in torchlight. These weren't ordinary maps, but celestial diagrams inked on silk, mapping the paths of planets and constellations believed to hold the fate of empires. Marco Polo watched, mesmerized, as the Khan's astrologers traced their fingers across these cosmic blueprints, whispering calculations that could delay a battle for weeks or send thousands of soldiers charging at dawn. To European eyes, it might have looked like mere superstition, but in the Mongol court, astrology wasn't mysticism, it was military science. What set these stargazers apart wasn't just their ability to read the heavens, but their unshakable authority. When they warned that Mars aligned unfavorably with Jupiter, even Kublai Khan, a man who toppled kingdoms, would halt his armies mid-campaign. Marco recorded one staggering instance where an entire invasion of Japan was postponed for nearly a year because the stars predicted disaster. The fleet sailed eventually and met a typhoon that drowned thousands. To the Mongols, this wasn't coincidence. It was proof the astrologers spoke a language older than empires. Yet beneath the mystique lay cold, calculating strategy. These wise men weren't isolated dreamers. They were embedded with troops, studying weather patterns, enemy morale, and supply lines alongside planetary positions. A bad omen might conveniently delay battle until reinforcements arrived or winter passed. Their predictions often hinged on observable realities, warning against summer campaigns in swampy regions where diseases flourished, or urging attacks during harvest seasons when enemy farmers would be scattered. By cloaking tactical advice in celestial terms, they gave commanders a divine mandate to make unpopular but necessary decisions. Marco noted the rituals with a merchant's pragmatism. Before critical battles, astrologers would scatter sheep's shoulder bones into fires, interpreting cracks in the scorched bone as divine messages. But here's what fascinated him most. When their predictions failed, they didn't face execution like failed European soothsayers. Instead, the Mongols accepted that even the stars spoke in probabilities, not certainties. This wasn't blind faith, it was a system flexible enough to absorb setbacks without crumbling. The real lesson, though, lay in how the Khan wielded this cosmic council. By publicly deferring to astrologers, he transformed military orders into celestial decrees. A general might grumble about delayed pay, but who argued with the heavens? When Marco finally returned to Venice, where wars were planned in smoky council rooms by nobles squabbling over pride, he understood the genius of this system. The Mongols hadn't just conquered land, they'd conquered time itself. turning the slow dance of stars into a weapon sharper than any sword. Marco Polo knelt closer to the fire, his breath visible in the frigid air, watching as a Mongol guard tossed chunks of glistening black rock into the flames. Within moments, the stones didn't just burn, they roared to life, hotter and longer than any wood he'd ever seen. To a Venetian raised on olive logs and charcoal, it was like witnessing sorcery. The Mongols called it black coal, but to Marco it became the stone that burns, a phrase that would later baffle European scholars when his travels were published. What stunned him most wasn't just the heat, it was how casually the Mongols treated this miracle. While European peasants shivered through winters, desperately foraging for scarce firewood, Mongol camps stayed toasty warm with baskets of these unassuming rocks. Marco described how cooks used coal to sear whole sheep in minutes, how smiths forged weapons in its blue-edged flames, and how even the poorest families could afford it, mined from veins that ran like black rivers beneath the steppe. But here's the twist, the Mongols didn't just burn coal, they mastered its logistics. They built entire trade networks around it, loading ox carts with black stones to supply distant outposts. Marco noted how messengers carried small pouches of coal alongside dried meat, allowing them to heat meals without stopping to gather wood. In a land where trees were scarcer than gold, coal wasn't just convenient, it was the lifeblood of survival. When Marco returned to Venice, his stories of burning rocks were met with sneers. How could stone catch fire? Surely the heat had addled his brain. Yet buried in their skepticism was a deeper truth. Europe's reliance on forests had blinded it to alternatives. While Mongol smiths crafted precision arrowheads in coal-fired forges, European armorers were still rationing charcoal, their furnaces dormant half the year. What Marco couldn't have foreseen was how his offhand observations would ripple through history. Centuries later, as Europe's forests dwindled, scholars dusted off his accounts, and coal became the fuel that powered the Industrial Revolution. The Mongols hadn't just discovered a curious rock, they'd unlocked an energy revolution, one that Marco, the ever-curious merchant, had carried home like a spark waiting for tinder. On the first day of autumn, when the grasslands turned to gold under a piercing blue sky, Marco Polo witnessed a spectacle that would haunt his dreams for years. 10,000 white horses moving like a living tide across the plain, their coats gleaming like fresh snowfall under the morning sun. This wasn't just a royal procession, it was the Khan's annual blessing of the steeds, a ritual so sacred that even the empire's fiercest warriors dismounted and knelt as the horses passed. Each animal was flawless, no speck of color, no uneven hoof, their manes braided with silver threads that chimed like distant bells. To the Mongols, these weren't mere beasts of burden. They were the earthly descendants of the sky god's own herd, creatures whose veins carried the wind itself. What made the ceremony unforgettable wasn't just its scale, though Marco's hand shook as he tried to count the endless rows, but the reverence that followed. As priests chanted ancient hymns, maidens in white robes collected mare's milk in golden bowls, fermenting it into arag, the tart, frothy drink that only the Khan and his highest nobles were permitted to taste. Marco, ever the curious outsider, begged for a sip and was swiftly rebuked. This wasn't just alcohol, it was liquid divinity, believed to carry the strength of the celestial herds into those who drank it. The punishment for unauthorized tasting, a slow death beneath the hooves of the very horses whose milk had been stolen. Yet beneath the mysticism lay cold political calculus. By controlling the white herds, the Khan didn't just command respect, he monopolized a potent symbol of legitimacy. Rival chieftains might boast armies or gold, but only Kublai could produce 10,000 unblemished steeds at will, proof that the heavens themselves favored his rule. Marco noted how visiting diplomats from Korea or Persia would tremble at the sight, recognizing this display as more than pageantry. It was a silent threat. If the Khan could muster such perfection from his stables, what horrors might his war horses unleash? The real genius, though, was in the logistics. These horses weren't gathered yearly. They lived in dedicated pastures guarded by deaf-mute herdsmen, chosen so they couldn't reveal secrets. Each colt was inspected at birth. Any with so much as a shadow of gray was sent to ordinary cavalry units. The chosen few lived like royalty, fed on grain sprinkled with powdered pearls, their hooves polished with scented oils. When Marco asked why such effort was spent on creatures never ridden into battle, a Mongol general smirked. A sword conquers land, these conquer souls. By the time Marco returned to Venice, where knights prized armored destriers for their brute strength, he'd learned the deeper lesson. The Mongols didn't just worship horses, they understood their power as living propaganda. Those 10,000 white steeds weren't just animals, they were the empire's beating heart, a reminder that some forces are too vast, too sublime to resist. And in their milk, their myth, and their terrifying perfection, Kublai Khan had found something more valuable than any weapon, a legend written in living flesh. Beneath the clatter of lacquered leather and steel, Mongol warriors carried a secret weapon so delicate it seemed absurd. A whisper-thin silk undershirt, softer than a noblewoman's handkerchief. Marco Polo first learned its purpose from a grizzled general who rolled up his sleeve to reveal a jagged scar. "An arrow did this," the man said, "but the silk saved my life." At the time, it sounded like superstition. Then Marco watched battlefield surgeons at work and understood. When an arrow pierced a warrior's armor, the silk didn't resist, it yielded, wrapping around the arrowhead like a cocoon. This meant the barbed tip could be extracted without tearing flesh, turning what should have been a mortal wound into a survivable injury. The brilliance lay in its simplicity. European arrows, with their wide cutting heads, relied on brutal trauma. But Mongol archers used needle-pointed projectiles designed to penetrate armor, only to be thwarted by their own clothing. Surgeons would gently pull the silk threads to ease the arrow out, often leaving barely a scar. Marco recorded one astonishing case where a warrior took 5 arrows to the chest, stood up, and walked away after treatment. To the Mongols, this wasn't magic, it was just another example of their ruthless pragmatism. Why waste time sewing wounds when you could prevent them from tearing in the first place? But silk's advantages didn't end there. On scorching summer campaigns, it wicked sweat away, preventing rashes beneath heavy armor. In winter, it trapped warmth without bulk. And unlike wool, which bred lice and infection, silk's smooth fibers resisted parasites, a small detail that kept entire armies healthier. The Khan's quartermasters didn't just issue these shirts, they stockpiled them by the thousands, trading with Chinese merchants for bolts of the finest weave. What Marco couldn't have known was how deeply this innovation unsettled their enemies. European knights, sweating in chainmail that turned every scratch septic, dismissed the Mongols as primitive horsemen until they faced them in battle. Imagine their horror when arrows that should have crippled their foes merely annoyed them, while Mongol archers fired volley after volley with chilling precision. Silk shirts didn't just save lives, they shattered morale. By the time Marco returned to Venice, he'd adopted the habit himself, wearing a silk tunic beneath his robes. His countrymen laughed until he demonstrated its power by catching a daggers thrust in the fabric and walking away unscathed. The real lesson wasn't about the silk, though. It was about the Mongol mindset. Every element of war, from the grandest strategy to the smallest stitch, could be refined into an advantage. While other armies obsessed over heavier armor or sharper blades, the Khan's warriors turned something as fragile as a moth's wing into a shield. And in that paradox, strength drawn from softness lay the heart of their invincibility. On a sweltering summer afternoon, when even the palace dogs panted in the shade, Marco Polo was summoned to a private courtyard and handed a silver bowl filled with something impossible. At first glance, it looked like finely shaved snow. Then the scent hit him, sweetened mare's milk, floral saffron, and something hauntingly unfamiliar, camphor, a resin so prized it was worth its weight in jade. He took a hesitant bite, and his tongue met not the expected crunch of ice, but a velvety cream that dissolved like a cloud. This wasn't just chilled food, it was alchemy. The Mongols called it Buda, but to Marco, it could only be described as frozen milk, a delicacy so far beyond Venetian cuisine, he feared his own family would call him a liar for describing it. The real marvel wasn't just the taste, it was the logistics. In a land where summer temperatures could boil water in cups, how did the Khan's chefs keep snow from melting? The answer lay in sprawling underground vaults, some as deep as 3 men's height, lined with straw and timber to insulate blocks of ice cut from winter rivers. Marco traced his fingers along the walls of one such ice house, stunned by the chill radiating through the packed earth. Workers descended daily with tongs, chiseling off just enough for the kitchens while preserving the rest beneath layers of sawdust and felt. It was a system so efficient, some pits stayed frozen well into autumn, defying the very laws of nature, but the true stroke of genius was in the flavors. While European nobles sprinkled sugar on fruit as the height of luxury, the Khan's chefs experimented like alchemists. They infused the cream with crushed rose petals from Persia, black sesame from Korea, even slivers of rare sandalwood. The most coveted version, reserved for imperial birthdays, was tinged gold with saffron and speckled with pine nuts, a dish meant to mimic the constellations, each nut placed precisely to mirror the night sky. Marco noted how diplomats from tropical kingdoms offered a taste, would clutch their throats in shock, never having imagined cold could be sweet. What Marco couldn't have known was how this dessert reflected Mongol ingenuity. The same empire that built history's fastest communication network had turned preservation into an art form. While European kings suffered through spoiled meat and warm ale in summer, the Khan dined on winter's bounty year-round. And in that fleeting spoonful of Buda, Marco tasted something far deeper than cream. He tasted the power of an empire that refused to be bound by seasons. When he later described these frozen milk banquets in Venice, even his fellow merchants scoffed. Ice in summer, preposterous. Yet centuries later, when Italian gelato makers traced their craft's origins, they'd find an unexpected thread leading back to those Mongol ice houses and the wide-eyed Venetian who first brought their secrets west. The real lesson wasn't just about dessert. It was about how the Mongols transformed scarcity into spectacle. In a world where most rulers measured wealth in gold or land, Kublai Khan flaunted his control over something far more elusive, time itself. To serve winter's chill on a summer platter wasn't just indulgence, it was a whispered reminder that the Khan commanded forces even the seasons obeyed. And for Marco, that first bite of Buda became more than a culinary revelation. It was the moment he grasped the true scale of Mongol ambition, an empire that didn't just conquer space, but bent the very elements to its will. The road to Samarkand stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, its dust clinging to Marco Polo's throat as his caravan rounded a bend, and there it rose, sudden and grotesque against the horizon. Not a watchtower, not a shrine, but a pyramid of human skulls, their hollow eye sockets staring blankly at the living. Some were bleached white by years of wind, others still clung with scraps of flesh, their teeth bared in eternal grimaces. This wasn't battlefield debris left to rot, it was architecture, each skull placed deliberately, layer upon layer, mortared together with clay and terror. Marco counted 12 tears before his guide yanked him away, hissing that to linger was to invite suspicion. These grisly landmarks weren't random acts of savagery, they were calculated psychological warfare. After crushing rebellions, Mongol generals ordered the slain skulls collected and stacked along trade routes, where merchants, pilgrims, and diplomats couldn't avoid them. The message was unambiguous: defiance had a price, and the Khan's justice stretched farther than any road. Marco noted how even hardened Silk Road bandits, who bragged of robbing royal caravans, would lower their voices and spur their horses faster when passing these towers. The corpses weren't just victims, they were part of the empire's nervous system, a silent alarm that kept the peace more effectively than any garrison. But the true horror lay in the details. Not all skulls were equal. At the base lay common soldiers, cracked and unremarkable. Higher up, the skulls of nobles and rebel leaders, often gilded or painted red, their prominence making them easier to recognize. Marco described one such tower near Bukhara where a local king's skull crowned the structure, its jaw wired shut with silver thread, a final insult to silence the man who dared rally his people. The Mongols understood spectacle. 1,000 anonymous dead might fade from memory, but the sight of a familiar face reduced to bone that lingered like a curse. What unsettled Marco most wasn't the violence itself. Venice had its share of public executions, but the efficiency. These towers required bureaucracy. Accountants tallied skulls, engineers designed their stability, scouts reported which routes needed reminders. The Khan's cruelty was industrialized, its message standardized across continents. Even more chilling, it worked. Marco met traders who altered entire routes to avoid regions where towers stood thick as trees, diverting wealth and influence into Mongol-approved channels without a single soldier's intervention. Yet hidden in this brutality was an unexpected pragmatism. The towers weren't just threats, they were maps. Travelers in unfamiliar territory could gauge their proximity to Mongol control by the freshness of the skulls. A crumbling tower meant safe passage. A newly built one signaled recent unrest and heightened patrols. Some merchants even used them as macabre milestones, counting the towers between oases. The Khan had turned fear into infrastructure, weaving his dominance into the very landscape. When Marco later recounted these sights in Venice, his listeners recoiled, imagining mindless barbarism. They missed the genius. The towers weren't just monuments to death, they were the birth of psychological deterrence, a system so potent it ruled millions without drawing a sword. And in their shadow, Marco grasped the Khan's most ruthless lesson. True power isn't just about killing, it's about making sure no one forgets you can. Even in broad daylight, Marco Polo learned to watch for shadows where none should exist, a flicker of movement behind a tapestry, a whisper of air near an alcove, the faintest indentation in a cushion where someone might have rested moments before. These were the only traces of the Khan's most feared enforcers, a brotherhood of warriors so skilled in stealth they were known only as the Silent Ones. Clad in lightweight black lamellar armor that absorbed sound rather than reflected it, their felt-soled boots left no prints on marble floors. Marco once described how a visiting diplomat joked about the Khan's imaginary ghosts, only to be found dead the next morning, a single razor thin cut across his throat, his chambers untouched from the inside. What made these assassins truly terrifying wasn't just their lethality. It was their invisibility in plain sight. They didn't skulk in hoods or masks. They moved through court as servants, musicians, even stable hands, their true identities known only to the Khan and his closest advisors. Marco recounted how a high-ranking minister once dropped a wine cup in shock when he recognized the gentle gardener pruning roses near the imperial pavilion as the same man who'd executed a traitorous general weeks earlier. The lesson was clear: trust no one, because death wore 1,000 faces. Their training bordered on the supernatural. From childhood, recruits were taught to control their breathing until it became inaudible, to walk across gravel without crunching a single stone, and to blend into crowds by mirroring the posture and gait of those around them. The most advanced could slow their heartbeats to mimic death, allowing them to lie motionless for hours in wait. Marco heard whispers of a technique called the spider's step, where assassins could scale sheer walls by pressing their fingertips and toes into microscopic cracks, their bodies flattened against surfaces like shadows at dusk. Yet their greatest weapon wasn't stealth, it was psychology. The Khan deliberately let rumors of their existence circulate while keeping their numbers and methods vague. A nobleman plotting treason might wake to find a single black feather on his pillow, a silent warning that could paralyze him with dread. Marco noted how even the empire's most brutal generals would suddenly grow pale and cooperative after receiving a seemingly innocuous gift, a scented handkerchief, a silver comb, items that always coincided with the disappearance of their rivals. The message was unmistakable. Compliance wasn't just advised, it was the only path to sunrise. What fascinated Marco most, though, was how these shadows shaped the empire's culture. While European courts flaunted their knights and heralds, the Mongols weaponized uncertainty. A whispered conversation in a hallway might be overheard by a servant or a silent one. A drunken boast at a feast could be reported before the wine dried on the table. This pervasive dread didn't just eliminate enemies, it stifled dissent before it could take root. By the time Marco left the Khan's service, he'd developed a habit Venetians found odd. He'd always pause mid-sentence in unfamiliar rooms, his eyes darting to the ceiling beams or a half-open shutter. Some called it paranoia. He knew better. It was the instinct of a man who'd walked among ghosts and lived to tell their tale. Marco Polo's first step into the Khan's private menagerie left him breathless, not from fear, but from the sheer impossibility of it all. Towering Indian elephants, their hides painted with intricate saffron designs, swayed beside snow leopards so pale they seemed carved from mountain mist. A peacock from Persia fanned its jeweled tail inches from a slumbering Tibetan bear, while scarlet macaws shrieked from gilded perches overhead. This wasn't just a zoo, it was a living map of the Khan's empire, every creature a testament to lands so distant, most Europeans believed them pure myth. The real power of this collection wasn't in its spectacle, though Marco noted how visiting envoys from Egypt or Byzantium would stagger at the sight, but in its silent message. Each animal represented a conquered kingdom, a trade route secured, or a tribute paid under duress. The elephants, seized from a rebellious Indian prince who dared withhold taxes. The snow leopards, gifts from Himalayan chieftains now serving as Mongol scouts. Even the playful golden monkeys chattering in bamboo cages had a story. They'd arrived with a Burmese delegation so terrified of the Khan's wrath, they'd hauled the primates across 2,000 miles of jungle rather than risk offending him. What fascinated Marco most, though, was how the Khan weaponized wonder. During diplomatic audiences, he'd casually feed grapes to a lounging tiger while discussing treaty terms, or let a python slither across his shoulders as he questioned spies. The effect was paralyzing. Marco watched hardened warriors from the Caucasus men who'd charge into battle against overwhelming odds break into cold sweats when a cheetah, trained to retrieve arrows during hunts, brushed past their legs. These weren't just displays of wealth, they were psychological masterstrokes, reinforcing that the Khan commanded forces beyond human comprehension. Yet behind the theatrics lay ruthless logistics. The menagerie required an army of its own, elephant handlers from Cambodia, bird keepers from Java, and teams of scribes who recorded each animal's diet, moods, and even dreams believed to be omens. The leopards dined on goat milk warmed to precisely the temperature of their mother's teats. The peacocks bathed in rosewater to maintain their iridescence. Marco once stumbled upon a heated argument between veterinarians over whether a sick crane required southern or northern herbal remedies, a debate that ended with the Khan ordering both, just in case. The lesson wasn't lost on him. While European kings displayed their power through gold or armor, the Khan flaunted his dominion over nature itself. Those prowling leopards and trumpeting elephants weren't just trophies, they were living proof that no corner of the earth lay beyond his reach. And as Marco later penned descriptions of rhinoceroses and giant unicorns, likely misidentified Indian rhinos, he must have known how his words would echo through the courts of Venice. If the Mongols could bend the wildest beasts to their will, what hope did mere kings have? The first time Marco Polo lifted a silver cup of Arag to his lips, he expected something akin to Venetian wine, smooth, fruity, perhaps slightly tart. What hit his tongue was a violent punch of sourness, like vinegar laced with grass, followed by a warmth that seared his throat and pooled fire in his stomach. This wasn't just fermented mare's milk, it was liquid courage, the lifeblood of Mongol diplomacy, and its effects were as unpredictable as a sandstorm on the steppe. Within 3 cups, Marco's carefully memorized phrases in Mongolian dissolved into slurred laughter, his legs refusing to obey as he toppled onto a pile of silk cushions, much to the delight of the Khan's grinning generals. These feasts were no casual gatherings. Under the flickering light of whale oil lamps, the Khan's hall transformed into a battlefield of endurance, where diplomats and dignitaries were softened by relentless toasts. Marco watched as a Persian envoy, determined to prove his mettle, gulped down 14 cups in quick succession, only to collapse mid-negotiation, his prized silk robe ruined by his own vomit. The Mongols didn't just tolerate such scenes, they orchestrated them. A guest who refused to drink was suspicious, one who drank too much revealed secrets. But the truly skilled navigated the razor's edge, sipping just enough to show trust while keeping their wits intact. The Arag itself was a marvel of nomadic ingenuity. Prepared in colossal leather sacks hung from wooden frames, it was churned daily by servants who risked kicks from temperamental mares during milking. The fermentation process, sped up by adding a portion of old batch like sourdough starter, could turn fresh milk into a potent brew within days. Marco noted how the Khan's tasters ranked batches by clarity, aroma, and most crucially, the speed at which they made a man's eyelids droop. The best batches, reserved for alliances and treaties, were aged with wild berries or honey, their deceptively sweet finish masking a kick that could floor a seasoned warrior. But the true genius of these feasts lay in their duality. While guests wrestled with dizziness, Mongol officials remained eerily sober, their cups secretly filled with watered-down arag or even plain mare's milk. Marco once spotted a general discreetly dumping his drink into a floor grate after a toast, his face the picture of cheerful inebriation. The lesson was clear: every sip was a test, every laugh a potential trap. An ambassador might wake the next morning with a pounding headache, only to realize he'd promised trade concessions or revealed troop movements under the Arag spell. By the time Marco returned to Venice, he'd developed a grudging respect for the drink that nearly broke him. While European kings sealed treaties with dry parchment and wax seals, the Khan wielded Arag like a weapon, one that forged bonds, exposed enemies, and occasionally left them snoring under the banquet table. And in those chaotic, laughter-filled halls, Marco glimpsed a truth that would haunt his dreams. In the Mongol Empire, even drunkenness was a calculated strategy. Marco Polo never suspected the elderly tea server who refilled his cup each morning, her hands trembling slightly. her eyes downcast until the day he glimpsed those same fingers moving with uncanny precision as she transcribed his private conversations onto a silk scroll. This wasn't just hospitality, it was theater. Across the Khan's empire, an invisible web of informants stretched from palace corridors to roadside taverns, turning every interaction into a potential report. Silk merchants noted which nobles overspent on rare fabrics. Stable boys memorized the destinations of unauthorized messengers. Even the musicians plucking lutes at banquets had a secondary role. Their melodies rose in pitch when diplomats whispered treason, a signal to scribes hidden behind lattice screens. What made this system so terrifying wasn't just its scale, it was its banality. Unlike European spies who lurked in shadows, the Khan's watchers thrived in daylight. A baker might pause kneading dough to eavesdrop on a customer's complaints. A tailor's measuring tape could conceal notched markings recording a client's political leanings. Marco described how a single incautious joke about the Khan's gout, muttered to a seemingly friendly goldsmith, resulted in 3 officials inviting him for a clarifying chat the next dawn. The lesson was brutal: trust no one, because loyalty was currency and every soul had a price. The genius lay in incentivization. Informants weren't coerced, they competed. A servant who delivered vital intelligence might receive a lifetime pension or a daughter's promotion to the imperial wardrobe. Merchants trading rumors earned tax exemptions. This created a self-sustaining ecosystem where betrayal wasn't just tolerated, it was the fastest path to prosperity. Marco once witnessed a fruit seller collapse in relief when guards arrested her neighbor instead of her, proof she'd outbid his tip about her son's rebellious poetry. Yet the true brilliance was in the feedback loop. The Khan's spies didn't just gather information, they manufactured reality. By leaking fabricated rumors, say, an impending purge of corrupt officials, they flushed out genuine conspirators through panicked reactions. Marco noted how entire rebellions dissolved when their leaders, fearing infiltration, turned on each other. The system's greatest power wasn't surveillance, it was the paralysis it induced, the way a dropped coin or a cough at the wrong moment could spiral into exile. When Marco finally returned to Venice, he caught himself scanning taverns for a little too attentive servants, hesitating before sharing even harmless gossip. The Khan hadn't just watched his empire, he'd rewired how people thought. And in that silent scrutiny, Marco grasped the ultimate tyranny. Not chains around the body, but whispers in the walls that made every man his own jailer. The banquet hall shimmered like a mirage as Marco Polo stepped forward, his boots nearly slipping on what appeared to be wet stone until he crouched and touched the illusion. What had seemed from a distance like a glistening river snaking through the feast tables was in fact a masterwork of engineering. A shallow trough lined with thousands of polished sapphire tiles, their surfaces angled to catch torchlight in rippling patterns. Servants poured wine along the channel with rhythmic precision, creating the uncanny effect of flowing liquid, while submerged pearls rolled lazily along the bottom like pebbles carried by a current. The air smelled of fermented grapes and jasmine, but the real intoxication was visual, a trick of perspective so convincing that Marco, despite his merchant skepticism, had to resist the urge to dip his fingers in for a drink. This wasn't just decoration, it was psychological theater. The Khan's artisans had studied how movement and light could hijack human perception. By aligning the tiles along precise geometric curves, they exploited the way peripheral vision processes motion, making stationary pearls appear to drift. The wine's viscosity was adjusted with honey to flow slower than water, enhancing the illusion of depth. Marco noted how visiting dignitaries would freeze mid-conversation, their eyes tracking the current with childlike wonder exactly as intended. In a court where power was measured by spectacle, This faux river did more than dazzle, it disarmed. A warlord from the Caucasus, notorious for his stubbornness in negotiations, reportedly dropped to his knees to examine the marvel, his defiance evaporating like the wine's aroma. The true stroke of genius, though, lay in the pearl's symbolism. Each one represented a tributary kingdom, their size and luster corresponding to the wealth and loyalty of the region they symbolized. When the Khan casually plucked a pearl from the river and gifted it to a favored guest, the message was unmistakable. He controlled not just the illusion, but the very sources of wealth it represented. Marco watched as an ambassador from Java, upon receiving such a pearl, immediately softened his stance on trade disputes. The river wasn't real, but its power over men's minds was as tangible as the stones beneath their feet. What Marco couldn't have known was how deeply this artifice mirrored Mongol strategy. Just as the river's flow was an engineered deception, so too were the empire's displays of generosity or menace. A gift of gemstones might precede a demand for tribute. A show of military restraint often masked impending attack. By the time visitors realized the river was stone and wine, they'd already surrendered to the Khan's narrative, a lesson Marco carried back to Venice, where he'd later advised doges to judge a ruler's strength not by his treasures, but by his mastery of illusion. And in that shimmering trough of tiles and trickery, he'd glimpsed the empire's most potent truth. Reality was just another weapon, and the Khan wielded it like a blade. The funeral procession moved in eerie silence, the only sound the creak of leather harnesses as a dozen oxen dragged the nobleman's shrouded body toward the steppes' horizon. Marco Polo stood just beyond the permitted distance, his presence tolerated but unwelcome, watching as the inner circle of mourners vanished into the grasslands like shadows at dusk. He'd spent years earning the Khan's trust, yet this was one ritual even he couldn't witness firsthand. What followed came only in fragments, whispers from drunken guards, the nightmares of a surviving slave, and the chilling emptiness of graves that left no trace. The Mongols didn't bury their dead, they erased them. Noble corpses were wrapped in felt and silk, then interred in pits so meticulously concealed that even the diggers themselves rarely survived. Marco heard of sacrificial horses slaughtered and arranged around their master's body, their legs folded as if in mid-gallop, a cavalry ready to ride into the afterlife. But the most unsettling rumors spoke of human offerings, slaves who'd served the deceased in life, from favorite cupbearers to stable hands, were allegedly strangled with silk cords and buried alongside their master, their mouths stuffed with gold coins to pay the underworld's toll. The Khan's own grandfather, Genghis, was said to rest beneath a river diverted over his tomb, its waters returned to their original course to erase all evidence. What made these rites so impenetrable wasn't just their brutality, it was their precision. Marco described how mourners would trample the burial site with 1,000 horses, then pitch tents atop it and feast for days, disguising the grave beneath hoofprints and ash. Later, saplings might be planted or livestock penned there, ensuring the earth looked disturbed for natural reasons. Even the noble's name became taboo, spoken only by shamans in private ceremonies. To the Mongols, memory was a vulnerability. A known grave was a place for enemies to desecrate or plunder. Better to vanish utterly, leaving behind only stories too terrifying to test. Yet for all their secrecy, the rituals betrayed a paradox. These warriors who laughed at death in battle feared its aftermath deeply. The elaborate precautions, the sacrificed servants, the hidden tombs suggested a belief that the dead could still suffer, still hunger, still need protection. Marco once stumbled upon a secluded cairn where offerings of fermented milk and dried meat appeared overnight, left by relatives who refused to reveal its location even under threat. The Khan's laws punished grave robbers with flaying alive, not just to deter theft, but because disturbing the dead risked unleashing their wrath upon the living. When Marco later shared these fragments in Venice, his listeners dismissed them as barbaric superstition. They missed the deeper truth. The Mongols hadn't just mastered the art of war, they'd perfected the science of disappearance. A people who could make entire cities vanish beneath their tents knew how to fold death itself into the landscape, leaving nothing behind but the wind and the terrible knowledge that somewhere beneath the unmarked grass, the empire's greatest secrets slept on silent, guarded, and forever beyond reach. Marco Polo's quill hesitated as he described Xanadu, the summer capital where Kublai Khan's palace shimmered like a mirage above the grasslands, its golden roofs reflecting sunlight so fiercely that travelers swore the city floated above the earth. But between the lines of his lavish accounts of marble courtyards and gardens stocked with exotic beasts, he let slip something stranger, whispers of a labyrinth beneath the pleasure domes, where corridors lined with jade statues led to chambers no outsider had ever seen. The Khan's attendants spoke of these vaults in coded terms, calling them the Earth Veins or Dragon's Hoard, but Marco caught glimpses of their contents: chests of Burmese rubies still crusted with battlefield mud, stacks of Persian manuscripts salvaged from burning libraries, even a golden tree with mechanical birds that sang when the wind blew through hidden pipes. What made these rumors tantalizing wasn't just the treasure, it was the palace's design. Xanadu's architects had built illusions into its very foundations. A fountain in the central courtyard, fed by an underground spring, masked the sound of workers moving goods below. Hallways ended abruptly in mirrored walls, disguising staircases that spiraled downward. Marco once watched as a servant pressed a seemingly random tile in a mosaic, triggering a hidden door that swallowed him whole. When questioned, the man reappeared minutes later, smiling blandly as if nothing had occurred. The lesson was clear. Xanadu's true wealth wasn't in its visible splendor, but in the secrets it swallowed like a silent desert swallowing bones. Yet the most intriguing clue lay in Marco's offhand mention of the Whispering Gallery, a curved hallway where spoken words traveled eerily along the walls, allowing conspirators to communicate across distances. Modern archaeologists suspect this wasn't just parlor trickery, but a security measure. By concentrating sound, the gallery could expose spies trying to eavesdrop, their footsteps or rustling robes amplified to betray their presence. The Khan didn't just hide his treasures, he engineered the very architecture to guard them. Centuries later, when romantic poets like Coleridge immortalized Xanadu in verse, they fixated on its surface beauty, the stately pleasure dome and sunny spots of greenery. But Marco's fragmented notes suggest a darker truth, that the palace was less a retreat than a brilliantly disguised stronghold, where every garden path and gilded pavilion existed to distract from the empire's true plunder, buried deep enough that even time would struggle to unearth it. And in that duality, the radiant palace and its shadow self, we see the Khan's genius writ large, the art of making conquest look like civilization and theft like tribute. The accusation came like a summer storm, swift, violent, and utterly unexpected. One moment Marco Polo was reviewing trade ledgers in the palace archives. The next he found himself dragged before a tribunal of scowling generals, their fingers tight around dagger hilts as they spat the word spy like a curse. The evidence seemed ludicrous at first, a misplaced sketch of a fortress wall, an overheard conversation with a Persian merchant about troop movements, even the frequency of his letters home to Venice. But in the Mongol court, suspicion needed no logic. The same system that rewarded loyalty with gold could condemn a man to death on a whisper. What made the ordeal truly terrifying wasn't the trial itself, a rushed affair where testimony mattered less than the accuser's rank. but the chilling realization of how easily years of trust could unravel. Marco had dined with the Khan's family, ridden in his hunting parties, even advised on trade routes. None of it mattered. As guards bound his wrists with rawhide straps, he noticed former friends avoiding his gaze, their silence louder than any betrayal. The Mongols had a saying, "Favor is sunlight on ice bright until it melts." Salvation came from the unlikeliest source. Kublai Khan, nearing 80 and increasingly sentimental, interrupted the proceedings with a single rasped command. Marco would later describe how the ruler's gnarled hand, usually trembling with age, steadied as he pointed to a carved jade paperweight on his desk, a gift from Marco years earlier, depicting the Rialto Bridge. "A spy," the Khan muttered, "does not bring memories of home to his enemy." The tension shattered like thin ice. The generals bowed, the accusers vanished, their fates best left unimagined, and Marco walked free, his legs barely supporting him. Yet the lesson went deeper than royal mercy. The Khan's intervention wasn't just about saving Marco, it was a calculated demonstration of power. By overturning the tribunal's verdict, he reminded his court that only he held the scales of life and death. Favor could be withdrawn, yes, but it could also be restored with a whim, keeping even the most trusted servants perpetually off balance. Marco would later write that for months afterward, officials who'd once ignored him now brought gifts of sweetmeats and silk, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. The incident left an invisible scar. Where Marco had once wandered the palace at all hours, he now timed his movements to avoid lonely corridors. His letters home grew vague, his sketches deliberately inaccurate. Even his famed curiosity dimmed when offered a tour of a new armory. He politely declined. The Khan's world had always been dangerous, but now Marco understood its true nature. A gilded cage where the lock could click shut at any moment, and only the keeper held the key. Years later, when Venetian authorities demanded proof of his travels, Marco would produce that jade paperweight as evidence. Its survival was no accident. While other treasures were sold or lost, he'd kept it close through storms and bandit attacks, not as a memento of imperial grandeur, but as a reminder that in the Mongol court, salvation could come from the smallest gesture, provided you'd earned it before the knives came out. And in that unassuming chunk of carved stone lay the final, bitter lesson of his exile. Sometimes the difference between legend and oblivion wasn't skill or courage, but knowing which trinket to give a homesick emperor. Marco Polo's travels might read like fiction golden tablets that commanded empires, palaces that vanished overnight, warriors who wore silk armor, but time has a way of separating myth from truth. For centuries, European scholars dismissed his accounts as the ramblings of a man who'd spun tales to impress his Venetian jailers. Yet scroll by scroll, ruin by ruin, archaeologists have unearthed proof that Marco's so-called fantasies were cold, hard reality. The Mongol Empire wasn't just real, it was a civilization operating on a scale and sophistication that left Europe in the dust. Paper money, ice cream, psychological warfare, these weren't just quirks of a distant culture. They were the building blocks of modernity, hidden in plain sight beneath the hooves of Mongol horses. What makes Marco's legacy so enduring isn't just the accuracy of his observations, it's the sheer audacity of the world he described. The Mongols didn't just conquer, they reimagined. While medieval Europe clung to feudal traditions, Kublai Khan's court functioned like a proto-global economy with standardized currency, a postal network faster than anything the West would see for 500 years, and a spy system so pervasive it would make modern surveillance states blush. Marco's descriptions of ice cream and coal-burning stoves weren't embellishments, they were glimpses of a technological edge that Europe wouldn't match until the Industrial Revolution. But for all their brilliance, the Mongols were never just inventors or administrators. Their true genius lay in duality. They could build a whispering gallery to amplify secrets and a pyramid of skulls to silence dissent. They curated exotic menageries to dazzle diplomats and deployed silent ones to slit throats before a victim heard a footstep. This wasn't contradiction, it was strategy. The empire thrived because it understood that power isn't just about controlling land, it's about controlling perception. Marco's writings capture this tension perfectly, oscillating between awe at their innovations and horror at their ruthlessness. The most haunting question isn't whether Marco told the truth, it's why his stories were ever doubted in the first place. Perhaps Europe's skepticism said less about Marco and more about the limits of their own imagination. A continent still mired in superstition couldn't fathom a world where paper held value, where ice survived summer, where an empire's strength lay not in stone walls but in silk shirts and celestial charts. Marco's greatest gift wasn't just chronicling the Mongols, it was forcing Europe to confront how small it really was. Today, we see their fingerprints everywhere. Banking systems trace back to the Khan's paper money. Modern logistics echo the Yam's relay stations. Even our concept of psychological warfare owes debts to those skull towers and whispered rumors. The Mongols didn't just shape their time, they quietly built ours. So which details stuck with you? The golden Pazer that bent an empire to one man's will? The frozen deserts that defied seasons? Or the brutal efficiency of a spy network that turned every servant into a potential informant? Drop your thoughts below. And if you've enjoyed this dive into history's shadows, don't forget to subscribe. The past is full of stories that outshine fiction, and we're just getting started.